And welcome back to the show. Millions of Americans could actually face eviction under President Joe Biden's executive order extending federal protections for renters through March 31st. Nearly 40 million Americans have been protected by some form of an eviction moratorium since the onset of COVID-19's pandemic. Public health officials argued the moratorium was necessary since individuals impacted by the pandemic would have been evicted, forcing them into shelters and further risking the spread of COVID-19. However, the question remains on many renters' minds is what will happen after the rent moratorium when they're still responsible for their rent payments. Joining us now to share their point of view on this matter, I'm joined by the activist and president of Kingsman Films Incorporated, Tony Lindsay. And Tony, good to have you.
Hey, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Hey, thank you. We'll get right at it because when we do talk about renters, obviously there is this reprieve through this moratorium, but we do know that every good thing must come to an end in terms of this. And when we look, a lot of people say, listen, even though this moratorium will be is enacted when it's lifted, I could possibly still be on the street. I know that's a great concern for you too.
Well, I think that what we've been lacking is nuance in this conversation, because while I understand, we all understand that some form of a reprieve is needed for tenants, but I think we're kind of missing out on what's happening to the landlords in this situation as well. One thing that we're missing from the conversation is that the moratorium isn't exempting homeowners from making mortgage payments the way that. Now, I know they say that they're not exempting tenants from making their rent payments, but that's essentially what's happening, and when it comes to the landlords, they're still going to have to make those payments, whether it's deferred to the end of the moratorium or in some cases to the back end of the loan. We can't forget that they still have to pay that money. But in places like New York City, where the landlord tenant court, it's pretty much a tenant court. People can really, like the tenants, unfortunately, usually get to walk away without paying any rent whatsoever. And it takes a very long process to evict them and remove them from the properties. So, I think that's a major problem that we're not considering, because we've been treating through this legislation, we've been treating all landlords as if they're just, these multi-millionaire billionaires with massive resources. But it's like we're forgetting about like the mom and pop landlords, the smaller landlords, the people who own 2 and 3 family homes who still go to work, but they need their rental income to stay above water. Like, so what about those people? We're forgetting about that. So we have to be careful when we cape for some of these policies, because at the end of the day, you cannot help one group at the expense of another group.
Right. And I've talked with lawyers on this show. We've had that conversation talking about how it seems as though almost the court system is pro-renter and the landlord seems to be the one that's going to end up with the short end of the stick, and they still got to come up with money.
Yeah.
Some of them don't get the PPP that's out there. And so you're really in a place of really trying to figure out where am I going to be able to go from here. So needless to say, there are some loopholes that are in this. What would you like to see to kind of like tighten up these loopholes?
Well, okay. Well, there are like some really ridiculous loopholes. Like one thing that we're seeing is where we have there's a hardship declaration form that tenants can sign, if they're experiencing hardship. So basically what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to fill out the hardship form, give it to your landlord or give it to the courts, and that's supposed to exempt you from being evicted for the duration of the moratorium. Let's remember, this moratorium has lasted, it's been a year now. And I know you said March earlier, but it's really up until May that we're at right now, and potentially even further than that. So that declaration form, it's extremely vague in the language, and it leaves the door open for people who do have the money to pay, the people who are working, the people who haven't been impacted. It leaves the door open for them to not pay their rent as well. And we know that that's something that is happening. So when Governor Cuomo was asked about this. Like, what do the mom and pop landlords do when they have tenants who have been in there, many of them who weren't even paying rent before the pandemic?
Right.
They're taking advantage of this moratorium right now. What do we do? What about all of those smaller landlords who are struggling to stay above water? What can they do? And Governor Cuomo's answer was, it was a milk toast, lukewarm, and I found it, really dismissive answer. He said what he said: the law is the law, and the fact is, you can't claim hardship if you weren't paying your rent before the pandemic. But that's exactly what's happening if you read the language of the hardship letter. And I actually have a quick, I don't know if you have the time, I can give you a quick excerpt from it.
Please go ahead. Yes.
Right, just to show you. Okay, so we know basically the purpose of the hardship letter is to, save people from being evicted because of the COVID pandemic. So it says, this is the box that you'll check. These are the options that you check as a tenant who's experiencing hardship. I'm experiencing financial hardship and I'm unable to pay my rent or other financial obligations for one or more of the following reasons. One, significant loss of household income during the COVID-19 pandemic. Two, increase in necessary out-of-pocket expenses related to performing essential work or related to health impacts during the COVID-19 pandemic. Three, it's about childcare. And four, moving expenses and difficulty. I have securing alternative housing. Make it a hardship for me to relocate to another residence during the COVID-19 pandemic. Isn't it pretty hard for anyone to, to find alternative housing and cover moving expenses during this pandemic? See, this language is very vague, and it also says other circumstances related to COVID-19 pandemic have negatively affected my ability to obtain meaningful employment. Okay, so if you go through that language, you see that it's very easy to find a windfall based off of the subject to interpretation type of window to get in there. So I just think it needs to be far more specific, because also while Governor Cuomo says, okay, they can't do this, they can still be evicted if they were not paying their rent before the pandemic. But how can that happen when all evictions have been stayed? How can that happen when the city marshal is basically closed and they say that they cannot enforce and carry out any evictions? So his answer was basically, you're on your own.
Mm-hmm. So talk to me about the poor and the middle class, because obviously when you talk about this, they're the ones that are really going to be predominantly hit too.
Right. I mean, you see, there are significant costs that are incurred as a landlord in this city, where most of the residential landlords are in fact middle class and by definition poor people. So what about the elderly people who are finding themselves facing imminent homelessness because they choose, to make a little rental income to supplement their tiny Social Security income? Many longtime property owners in this city can't even afford the cost to live in this city, and that's what drives them to rent the spaces in their homes in the first place. And that falls squarely in the lap, in my opinion, that falls squarely in the lap of this mayor and the previous two administrations. There's been a lot of reckless budgetary spending. We had the Thrive NYC program. So I feel like there's been a lot of recklessness when it comes to the budget. And even though, the whole country has been reeling from the response to the COVID-19 pandemic, there's also been a lot of reckless spending that needs to be addressed. I mean, we have issues like, why are we spending $6 billion in policing instead of dedicating more financial resources from that budget to the social and the health programs that are needed to even mitigate the circumstances of crime in this city? You know what I'm saying? So there's a lot of wasteful spending. And there needs to be more money that is allocated to these landlords, mostly smaller landlords who just can't afford to survive right now. They still have to pay utilities. They still have to maintain these properties where people are living for free, and there are a lot of expenses that landlords incur. So what are they supposed to do when they're forced to sit for a year and a half with no money? I mean, you can see stories everywhere. There's a story about a 94-year-old man in Brooklyn. He had a tenant that wasn't paying rent. I guess he wasn't paying for like 2 years. The guy, he finally got an eviction order for the tenant to be removed in April of last year. But then the COVID pandemic happened and they did the moratorium. So that same guy who was supposed to be evicted in April of last year is just sitting back, relaxing for free in that 94-year-old man's house. And he's like back $50,000 in rent. There's another story about an elderly Black man. He bought, I think, a 10-family unit back in the 60s. He has his tenants in there. No one's paying because of the moratorium. And he himself is facing eviction where he lives because he's not getting any rents from the tenants in the property that he has. So people are being forced. I mean, as homeowners, I'm a homeowner, I'm a property owner, and I'm also a landlord myself. And it's like, when you sit back and you look at this, it's like we saw this huge upward transfer of wealth, the largest we've ever seen in this country, take place when Congress passed that original so quote unquote stimulus package that gave trillions of dollars to these corporations. Remember, through this pandemic, the wealthiest people in this country, their wealth has increased precipitously. But everyone else, their wealth and their people are facing poverty, homelessness. So, while they did that, we're debating on whether people should get like a one-time $1,400 check. So in New York City, it's kind of like, the way it seems to me is like Mayor de Blasio and Governor Cuomo, they're trying to follow that model of this new upward transfer of wealth. Why do I say that? Because if you look at the real estate trends, you'll see that there are a lot of empty businesses now. Like, there's a lot of available real estate that you're going to see in New York City very soon at the end of this, because I think like 50% or more of small businesses have been decimated. About 50% of restaurants, they're not coming back. So there's a lot of real estate. And then when it comes to, these residential property owners, most of them, they can't afford to live here anymore. We're being squeezed out. So most people are going to be forced to sell their properties for pennies on the dollar. So who is going to be able to grab up these properties? So I think, the way people in poorer communities, we just see this as just another way of facilitating mass gentrification of New York City and pushing poor people out.
Yeah, I was looking at some statistics while you were talking with reference to this. And one of the things that came up is the amount of people, particularly African Americans and communities of color, that will face a backlog as landlords in the court system, given the fact that there's already a huge delay in the court system. If you're ever going to get your just due for equity, it seems like it's not going to happen right away, because you already have an existing backlog. Now you're adding these new cases, which potentially could mean people will ultimately lose out and lose their businesses and potentially lose their homes too.
Right. And we have to remember, this boils down to something that it's twofold, the expenses for the landlord. See, our expenses are twofold, because not only are landlords providing maintenance and utilities for people who are living in their houses for free, but when the landlords go to court, they have to find additional monies to pay for legal representation, while free legal representation is going to be offered to the tenants. So I don't know. Well, to the people who have experience in, housing court and landlord tenant court, most people know that usually these evictions, they end in settlements. And these settlements are usually where the landlord ends up agreeing to pay the tenants a nuisance fee, basically to get them out quickly. That's literally extortion. That is literally extortion. So you not only have the cost, you have a landlord, small property owners who have been impacted by the pandemic. Many of them have lost their jobs. So they've also lost their rental income on top of that. They also have to incur all of the financial responsibility of maintaining properties where tenants are living for free. And then when they finally allow the eviction processes to return, now you're going to be stuck in court for many more months, spending potentially thousands upon thousands of dollars to get a tenant out of the property who basically, in many cases, you may have to pay them to leave. And I'm not trying to castigate tenants, because I understand that a lot of people are being impacted, and tenants, they definitely do need help. But like I said earlier, you cannot help one group at the expense of another, and you cannot paint this situation with one broad brush, because you are going to find a multitude of people, as we see now, who are taking advantage of this situation. And unfortunately, New York City has the worst laws and procedures as it pertains to the eviction process in this country, meaning that it is extremely biased in favor of tenants and promotes people squatting and remaining in properties without paying any rents. And this always leads to property owners having to forfeit their properties because they cannot afford the cost. So, I just want people to understand that there's a lot of nuance to this conversation, and there's never going to be a situation where you can find one broad solution for everyone, because a lot of landlords are really hurting. So perhaps rather than just saying they don't have to pay and they will still have to continue to pay, why haven't we been discussing some sort of a voucher system or some real tangible rent relief where where money is provided to the tenants to be able to pay their rents during this time? Why is no one talking about that? Why? Because that it relieves the city of a certain level of accountability, but it's going to come back and visit them again, because the cost, you're going to see homelessness skyrocket in the coming year, although it has already skyrocketed under Mayor Bill de Blasio. We're seeing homelessness and the mentally ill out on the streets. It's ridiculous. That's why it's at an all-time high. So imagine how this problem will be exacerbated once the courts reopen and people are now, a lot of these property owners who were facing foreclosure and repossession, the clock has started on that again. Remember, so now the clock restarts on that. And unfortunately, a lot of those people, had they been receiving rents during the past year and up to potentially a year and a half when it's over, they likely would have been able to save their properties. But this legislation has guaranteed that they are going to lose their properties. And there was already, from what I heard, a landmark decision that was made just recently in Kings County Supreme Court, where it's going to make it very difficult for people to appeal these foreclosure actions. Yeah. So we really need to pay attention to what's going on here, because, when it comes to, this massive push to tell everyone, hey, we're going to save you, don't pay rent, we're really destroying an entire group of people. People lose their properties, someone's going to come right back in and they're going to get rid of you anyway.
Right. Tony, we got to leave it there. Great conversation. Thank you for sharing with us here on the Social Justice Forums, and we'll be bringing you back soon.
All right. Thank you. Appreciate it.
All righty. And listen, we want you to stay with us. We do have more show. Don't go anywhere. The Social Justice Forums. We'll be right back.